was that? Some of you probably know all about this. You were probably there. The reason that the Occupy protest of 2011 and the fact that it was sited on the steps of St Paul's Cathedral and on the land immediately around the cathedral. Why were they there? Well, actually, those protesters did not initially want to be there. That protest was called Occupy London Stock Exchange. And the whole idea of that protest, at the same time as Occupy Wall Street was happening in America, the whole idea was that protest was going to be directly engaged with targeting the financial system, and they wanted to protest outside the London Stock Exchange. But the London Stock Exchange is just behind St Paul's Cathedral in a square called Paternoster Square. And that square is entirely privately owned, privately controlled, policed by private security guards, lots and lots of CCTV, and political protest is not allowed in those places at all. I'll go on to tell you something about these sorts of private places. But before I do, I just want to outline how basically the City of London, the square mile that is the City of London, has actually become a series of enclaves of these entirely privately owned places. And actually what emerged was that the steps around St Paul's Cathedral and the land around there was just about the only genuine public space left in the square mile of the City of London. So that's why the Occupy protest was on the steps of St Paul's Cathedral. As it happened, it gave a great backdrop to the protest and it exposed the rifts in the church, and it brought the issues right to the forefront. So actually I don't think it was a bad thing for the protesters, but the point is that's not where they wanted to be. They wanted to be outside the London Stock Exchange, and that place was privately owned. And the feature of privately owned spaces that we'll focus on particularly today is that they do not allow political protest, a whole range of things that they don't allow. Anyway, so the Occupy protest was on the steps of the cathedral for that reason, and there was another camp in Finsbury Square, and Finsbury Square actually is also just outside the square mile City of London. It's part of the London Borough of Islington, so that's why that was public land as well. So that's why the protest had that shape. Okay, I just want to tell you something about the privatisation of parts of the city. So this is a model that began in the UK in the late 1980s and early 1990s with Canary Wharf and the Broadgate Centre. These were the first very large-scale, privately owned places. Now, Canary Wharf was a finance centre. It was built specifically to meet the needs of business. It was built with these very, very large banks which followed the deregulation of finance in 1985 called Big Bang. So it was really that sort of environment which housed the new finance industries of the globalised economy. But the point I want to make is that this model of private ownership of places actually started in the late 1980s in Canary Wharf. But actually this has now spread, and this is the template for all new development all around the UK. So a model which began specifically with the finance industry in mind to meet the needs of business has spread, and it's the way that we're developing new places all around Britain. So for example, Liverpool 1 in the heart of Liverpool, that's 34 streets, 43 hectares in the centre of Liverpool, entirely privately owned. Cabot Circus in Bristol, very similar. Westfield Stratford City, just been built just by the Olympic Park, very similar. The Olympic Village, another entirely privately owned space. This is how we are developing all our new places. Now, what are the characteristics of privately owned space? Basically, there's a whole range of behaviours and activities which are not allowed in those spaces, ranging from skateboarding, cycling, rollerblading, even eating and drinking in some places, also taking photographs, filming, and critical to this discussion, no political protest. If we were in Canary Wharf, we would not be having this discussion because we would have been escorted off the premises. Political protest is not allowed in private places. Now, alongside this model of privately owned, newly created space, there's another model as well, which is the incorporation of private control of city streets through business improvement district companies. And these are being set up all around the country. Business improvement district companies are a company which is paid for by the surrounding businesses, and the aim is that they will improve the environment to meet the needs of those businesses. Now that is also not a democratic model, because it is only for the needs of the surrounding businesses. Residents in the area do not have a say or a vote, and nor do the citizens of the wider city. So you've got these two models, the privately owned places and then this private control of places at the same time. And very often the two models overlap, because a business improvement district company might, for example, police a privately owned place. Now, what is the connection with here in Parliament Square? Well, this is a public part of the city. It's not privately owned. It is not under the jurisdiction of a business improvement district. But what we've started to see is that this private approach to managing the city, which started off in places like Canary Wharf, has crept into the rest of the city. And actually now this area is, I think, under the aegis of Greater London Authority security guards, who I think are called heritage guards. So they are here alongside the police. Boris has his special heritage guards, who probably look a little bit more friendly and might be wearing sort of green fleet. Well, okay. So there's all sorts of overlapping. Yeah, that's who I'm talking about. Yeah, and so there are all sorts of overlapping securities in the city. This space here is a particularly special sort of space, if you want, because it has been the focus of protests since 2001 and Brian Hoare's anti-war protest, which began then. All of these special laws have been made actually exclusively for Parliament Square. So it's a sort of unusual sort of space. But this public space in the sort of centre of our democracy now has its very own special laws, which are prohibiting staying overnight and all sorts of various aspects which you guys are all more familiar with than I am. You're at the sharp end of all of these new restrictions. But what I've just been trying to sketch out here is how these processes towards the growing privatisation of public space, which started in Canary Wharf and the finance centre there, this is now spread out, and this is the way that the city is being formed increasingly. Cities all around Britain now, new places, are all subject to these private rules and regulations. And actually what it means is that we are squeezing out democratic space. Not only do we not have a democratic space here opposite the democratically elected Houses of Parliament, increasingly large parts of the city are privately owned, and that means that they are not democratically run. Now, ultimately, what is that a reflection of? Well, actually, that is a reflection of the social and political economic realities of the city we live in. If more and more of the city we live in is not democratically run, that tells us one thing: we are not living in a democratic space. Now, there are still parts of the city which are democratically run. You know, it's a mixed picture in Britain, but I think what we're starting to realise is that we need to fight for our public spaces and our democratic spaces, because if we don't, this creeping privatisation will cover more and more of the city. I'll just leave you with a final example. Often when I give these talks, people say to me, well, you know, the great estates of London, they were built in this way. There was a once private owner, an aristocrat, a duke or an earl, who owned that whole space in Belgravia or in Mayfair. The Georgian squares and terraces, some of Britain's finest urban heritage, they were built in that way. But actually, that's true. And these beautiful squares, that's how they came about. But what we don't see now is that those squares were surrounded with high gates and fences, and they had security guards and sentry boxes, and they were closed off to the public. People were not allowed in these places. And actually, as democracy grew in power, central government, local government grew in power, the franchise, the right to vote was gradually widened, what we started to see was huge public protest against the gating off of these places, and that was actually heard in Parliament, and it resulted in 2 parliamentary inquiries in the mid-19th century. And the upshot of that was that Parliament said these landlords are no longer allowed to shut people out of these places, and that henceforth local authorities would actually adopt, to use the jargon, they would adopt the streets and public places of the city which had been gated off. So that was a hard-won democratic achievement which came about because of political protest. Now what we're seeing with the privatisation of more and more of the city is that that hard-won democratic achievement is going into reverse. So I'll leave it there. And if
What's the name of your book?
ground control.
PFI, while it's still being paid off, is that privately owned?
PFI is massively complex and it's connected to the processes that I've been talking about. I'm not an expert on PFI. PFI, as far as I know, has enabled the government, the state, to build large public projects such as hospitals, schools, etc. But the problem, the sting in the tail, is that huge amounts of debt have to be paid off by those same schools and hospitals for, like, you know, generations to come. And that's a crippling debt which undermines their ability to deliver public services. PFI